Alright guys, we need to talk. So DJI recently released the Osmo Action. It's an action camera, very similar to the GoPro Hero 7. I've seen a lot of reviews comparing the two cameras, but I feel like a lot of them sort of miss the point on how they perform and how you can compare them. So as you know, someone who works day in, day out with GoPros, filming with mini quads, you see one up there. I needed to know how well the performance is of the camera and how well you can control all the settings and how everything works and how you can get the best out of it. So hopefully, this is the truth about the Osmo Action. So right off the bat, let me tell you about what I really like on the camera. First thing is the de-warp feature. You can actually de-warp 4K 60 video, which you cannot do on the GoPro. You can only do that at 2.7K. And even then, on the GoPro, it tends to crop in a lot, like 10%, whereas this is actually really wide. So you could shoot 4K 60 video, and the result comes out super wide, de-warped. You can also have that in pictures, which I really like, and I've been taking pictures like that for quite a few days, and I really like those. Next thing I like is the user interface. I feel like the manual controls, like if you want to set your shutter speeds or ISOs and whatnot, I find that quite intuitive. I quite like it, a bit better than on the GoPro. The way the automatic exposure works as well is really nice. It tends to favor more of the highlights, whereas the GoPros tend to blow those out a bit. Yeah, I quite like it for that. So to understand how these cameras work and how to compare them, let's maybe break down what they actually do. So if this is your picture, that is going to be a tree. There is whatever house, that's your picture, that's the image that you're trying to capture. First thing you're going to do is this is going to go through the lens, right? Go through the lens. Maybe lenses are better or worse, you never know. And then there's called a sensor. Both GoPro and the Osmo actually have the same size sensor. The size of the sensor usually determines how that much dynamic range you can get and things like that. So, but they're pretty comparable here, so it doesn't matter. If we wanted to do a real analysis of the quality, we should have a look first at this before the camera does anything. And this is raw. Let's have a look at some pictures with this. Alright, so let's compare the two cameras. So I've taken this, here 2 shots just in the street, just parked down the road. Both cameras were held just right next to each other. They were both using the same settings of a thousandth of a second shutter speed. The f2.8 is the same on both cameras. The ISO was fixed at 100. And yeah, so basically if the two cameras had a different, did things differently in the sensor, you would see it somewhere here. So first thing first, you will notice that the Osmo is slightly darker. By how much? Let's move over here and try to compensate for that. The Osmo, probably about this much. Yeah, so you see now both cameras have roughly the same exposure. So the Osmo seems to be slightly darker. Where it gets interesting is now if we go on both cameras and we move the sharpening here, that is done to 0. Just so you get it, this sharpening is basically done on the raw image. The image that you see here, I'm basically treating it in the computer. It is taken from the lens just after the sensor took it. It is directly stored as a raw file, and then you can, cut all the processing out. So if you start looking at some details, comparing the GoPro to the, where is it here? To the Osmo. Let's try to line those up a bit. Do roughly be it. So GoPro, Osmo, GoPro. I don't know, I don't really see a big difference. In terms of the details and how much has been captured by the sensor, it seems roughly the same. One thing we can perhaps do is look at this dark tree. So this is the Osmo. I'm going to just pump the the shadows to max, so you can get all the details here on this tree. If we go over to the GoPro, we do the same thing. I mean, we're pulling out the same amount of information, it seems. Yeah, I don't know. I can't really tell these images apart, to be very honest. Maybe some of you can. Maybe some of you. Looking at the details here in the leaves, see if anything's been overly compressed. No. All right, so I don't really see a difference. So at ISO 100, honestly, the two pictures are identical. As long as you account for the fact that the Osmo is slightly darker, well, that's that. All right, so now let's look at some low light performance. So I've taken 3 pictures at ISO 400, 800, and 1600. Let's do 800. I usually don't shoot at 800 because it just gets very grainy. Let's make sure that the sharpening is all the way down on the GoPro picture, and on the Osmo, we're taking the sharpening all the way down. Let's make sure that the white balances are the same. You'll notice that they're not exactly 5500, although I did ask them to be 5500. There's on one. Let's do 5500 on the other. There we go. Okay, so first things first. The Osmo is still a bit darker, so let's just pump that up slightly. Okay. Now the colors are not exactly the same. You know, the white balance is the same, the exposure is the same. Everything was manually locked to be identical. Anyway, if you look at the details, I don't know, of this little bush over there, like we have a bit more grain for sure compared to the earlier picture. On this fence here as well, we're starting to lose some of the detail here of what's going on. I don't know. The lens distortion is definitely a bit different. But the images are very, very, very similar. Okay, so now we've seen that in the raw pictures, the lens and sensor combo on both cameras, the Hero 7 and the Osmo, are relatively similar. We can look at the next step, which is essentially just onboard processing. This is going to be everything from the choice of white balance to the choice of sharpening and whatnot. So let's look at some video that comes out. All right, so let's look at some videos now. So I have here 2 clips of the same thing. I'm basically showing the GoPro Hero 7. This is all shot in 4K. There's no stabilization. The shutter speed is fixed. The white balance is fixed. Everything's the same on both cameras. And you have the GoPro and the Osmo right beside it. So right off the bat, you can notice that sort of similarly to video mode, the Osmo is photo mode. Sorry, the field of view is slightly smaller on the Osmo, but that's not a very big deal. But then the big deal though is the sharpening. If you look at the leaves here, it's all sort of a bit hazy because I turned the sharpening off or low on the GoPro. Whereas on the Osmo, you can't actually control the sharpening, and the sharpening is nuts. Nuts, I tell you. So let's zoom in here. Look at these leaves. Oh, this is horrible, 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 horrible. If I move over to a separate area, which I wanted to show you, for example here, with this little, you see a bit of the leaves, you see a bit of the grass, and the trees in the background and stuff. And if you compare that to the GoPro, well, it's this is what the sensor actually records. We saw this in the raw files. This is the same thing. If you don't sharpen an image, it comes out a bit smooth like that. That's how it is. But then the Osmo decides to sharpen this thing like crazy, and there's just no way to turn it off. Now, if you really wanted this look on the GoPro, you just go to your effects here, you just grab a sharpen, you drop that on, and then sharpen here, sharpen amount, you crank that like crazy, I don't know, about 100, and there you go. There you have the same sharpening as the Osmo. And I mean, this normally is a step that you do at the very end, It's just so I just don't understand why DJI has not allowed us to control this. I'm assuming they will change it at some point, but that's how it is. All right, if we step this back again, well, so the colors are way more muted on the Osmo. I mean, this is what you want. It was recorded in decine-like profile. You want something a bit muted. The Hero 7 is quite notorious for boosting the greens quite a bit. It tends to be very saturated. The Hero 6 actually doesn't do this too much, but you know, this is in flat color profile, by the way. So normally it's not that crazy on the Hero 6, but the 7 sort of boosts colors a bit. This is to liking, I guess. As we said, the quality is sort of the same. All right, so now you have, this is without stabilization. This is GoPro's Hypersmooth, and this is Rocksteady. So you'll see at each step, you're cropping in like 10%, about, that's what GoPro states for Hypersmooth, 10%, and then another extra 10 to 10%. So you're roughly at 20% crop on the Osmo, and then it is impossible for us to know how the quality evolves because they just over-sharpen everything like crazy. So I don't know if you get how the quality looks really. Just no way to do it. All right, so here it is again. Here we have the GoPro Hero 7 at 4K 60, just full frame, no stabilization. Here is now with Hypersmooth. You can see the boundaries here. This is all the stuff that we lost. So it's essentially a crop in, and you know, this is the area that you stay with. And then now with the DJI Osmo, it's again another 10%, over 10% crop in on what was before. So Hypersmooth gives you all this to be honest, and then you just, with the Osmo, you only have this tiny little region. So I mean, so right now this is just a test, but I mean, once you start trying to go mountain biking, or if you're trying to go snowboarding, or if you're trying to do any sort of action sports, usually you want a lot of field of view, and this is just way too much of a crop for me. I don't know. Okay, so we've been through the processing stage now. We've seen that there is a sharpening problem, a very serious sharpening problem on the Osmo. There's just no way to tune that, and then we're just sort of stuck with that. I hope DJI addresses that problem at some point, but for now, this is just what we're stuck with. Next thing is going to be the stabilization. All right, so to test the stabilization really a bit better, I wanted to, compare the Osmo to the other best solutions that we have on the market. So right now, it is obviously the Hero 7, which has the Hypersmooth, but there's also the Hero 6 combined with Rocksteady Go. I'll probably make a separate video about Rocksteady Go, but just so you know, it is a technique by which you take a full sensor readout on the GoPro, you take a 4:3 image, and then you send that through a post-processing program, and then it works out the best possible path, the smoothest path out there, and it gives you just unreal smoothness. And it's hard for these onboard stabilizations to compare with that, just because it is post. And then the cameras here, to make the stabilization, they need to sort of anticipate what you're doing. They can't just rely on having all the data. They need to anticipate actively what you're going to do and where you're going to go, and then how to make that prediction. So it is very hard for these cameras to do the right thing. But anyhow, let's look at this setup here. We have our 3 cameras on there. They're all hard mounted. All 3 cameras are set up with the same parameters, and let's just look at the image. So I don't have an ND filter for the Osmo, so I basically kept all 3 cameras just with no ND filter and just automatic type settings. So here's the Osmo. The shutter speed is a bit high, just because it was end of afternoon, pretty bright, and so it looks a bit jarry, but globally it does pretty well. The view is quite zoomed in, as you'd expect, as we saw it before, but that's okay, let's say. The image comes mildly smooth, I'd say. To me, this resembles a Hero 6. There was just some jitter there. I'll talk about more of that bit more later. Just in terms of stabilization and how it feels, to me it really feels like a Hero 6. The Hero 6 was pretty good as long as you went straight paths or nothing too active, let's say. When the path is simple and smooth, it's relatively easy to make it smoother. to give you a nice straight line, but as soon as you start doing crazy maneuvers, it just sort of gives up, and it just just creates something which isn't quite as smooth as you'd like it to be. But I mean, this, you know, feels okay. Maybe if you look at it on a small screen, this works, but as soon as you look at it on a big screen, it's pretty jarring, and that's probably just because of the shutter speed. But what I really wanted to show you was in a different clip. If I open up this guy here, and I skip to somewhere here, this is okay. We already saw that outside it seemed to be okay when the shutter speed was really high, but then as soon as you go in the woods, whoa, this was very great. When you go inside the woods, it needs to sort of raise the shutter, well, lower the shutter speed a bit, give you a slightly bit more motion blur. And this seems to have some issues with this camera. Let me find a good segment to demonstrate that. All right, so here I was trying to make a nice smooth line through those trees, and if you see here, you see those vertical jitters that it has? Here it's starting to get worse. These are starting to get really, really, really bad. This is terrible. Like, this is absolutely unusable. Let me show that again. Just a vertical pitch jitter. This is obviously, you know, due to the drone, because there's high frequency vibrations going through the camera, and the camera wasn't necessarily designed to be on a drone, so you know, it was probably meant to be on a helmet somewhere, and not all cameras can deal with that as well as the Hero 7. Let me maybe show you the Hero 7 here. You see, this is just unusable and terrible. Let me show you the Hero 7 in the same setup. Yeah, this is the same moment right here. Everything is nice and smooth at this point, as it was on the Osmo. But look at the sharpness of all like the little things, of all the leaves, the trees. I did not put any sharpening, so it's not as jarry. But yeah, this comes out perfect. And this is, to me, one of the great strengths of the Hero 7, is that it is really, really, really good at taking any of your garbage that you throw at it and then pumping out something super smooth and super clean. So I like it, you know, when there's hard conditions, when it's very windy, when I know it's gonna be very shaky. I just slap on the Hero 7 Hypersmooth, and honestly, the image comes out really good usually. So the Osmo for sure does not do that as well. So the next test that I did, so this is again the Osmo, just to compare that again. Look at those jitters all over the place. Anyway, so the next test that I did, I assumed, okay, this is high frequency vibrations. We can help that. So in the second iteration, I did the drone like this. Now you see there's these little bouncy legs that I put on each of the camera. The Hero 6 actually took one too, because I was having trouble stabilizing real steady go with this. But anyway, I'll talk about that another time. In the second iteration, the Osmo and the Hero 6 had the bouncy legs, and here I am in the forest. And so I don't know, I'm not exactly sure what happened, but some of my clips came out great, some of them not so great. In this case, I actually fixed my shutter speed at 1/20th, 1/120th, because I wanted to have some motion blur. It's a good way, 1/120th is a good way to have motion blur. And let me just do first some general forest flying. And the forest flying honestly works pretty well. Most of the footage, I would say, looked way better, just because it's not as jarring. It still has all the, whoa, all right, that was not a good clip. Let's take one where I'm do some general, okay, this is better flying. All right. So you see it is less jarring. It's still super sharp. You can't get rid of that. There's just nothing to do with it. But you can add some motion blur so it doesn't look as aggressive on the eyes. And whoop, that's not another crash. But I'm just cruising around, and you can almost see all my control inputs. So it's not extremely smooth, and which is one of the things I found a bit disappointing on it. But you know, it does what it does. and the jitters are actually not really gone. And this is, well, the next thing I wanted to show you. I highlighted this one as stutter. There. It's a bit subtle, but maybe you can see it. I know you're going to be looking at this compressed on YouTube, but there's that slight pitch jitter that is still there. It's especially seeable when I go a bit slow, like right here. There's a slight bit of it, which makes the image a bit crazy. And I mean, honestly, I don't know what is doing this. I don't know if it's the stabilization, which just isn't solid enough, or if this has something to do with the sharpening, the over-sharpening that they do. I don't know. Either way, let me show you now an example where it actually worked. What I had to do was change my shutter speed from 1/120th to 1/240. So you double that shutter speed. And this is another day out. And then here I'd say, okay, this is how it's supposed to be done. This is a good result for it. Yeah, I didn't have any jitters this time. You still get sort of sharpening artifacts in some of the corners, like noise and sharpening combining to give you these artifacts. GoPro does this as well if you put the sharpening high. This is why I turn it off usually. But anyway, yeah, I'll just leave you with some flying here, just so you can get a feel for how the Osmo works. Okay, so let's have a look how the, let's say, 3 main solutions for mini quads compare in terms of stabilization. I've sort of chopped the screen up into 3 parts, 3 segments. I do apologize if this is maybe a bit confusing, but this is the only way I could find to show those at the same time. So at the top here you have the Hero 6, which is stabilized in Real Steady Go. You have the Hero 7 in the middle, which is actually shot in 2.7K linear mode, because I wanted to compare linear things with Hypersmooth, obviously. And Rocksteady is at the very bottom on the Osmo with dewarp on. And what I can already say just straight off the bat is that the Osmo and the Hero 7 roughly have about the same framing. The crop factor is very similar, but then the Hero 6 with Real Steady Go is way wider. So it captures the whole sensor, whereas the 2 other solutions really crop in. In the case of the Hero 7, the Hypersmooth crops in about 10%, and then the linear mode crops in another 10%, making it actually as narrow as the Osmo. But then the Osmo, on the other hand, if you put on Rocksteady, it crops in a huge amount, and then when you put on the dewarp, it owns only a tiny bit more. So the dewarp is actually not too bad compared to the Hero 7. The Osmo is definitely much better at dewarping images. So this is a clip, so just to get the feel of the different stabilizations. So I know it's a bit hard to look at 3 feeds at the same time. I'd suggest just looking at one of the segments and just staring at it for a bit, and then just getting the feel for how it moves. You'll see that the Hero 6 in Real Steady Go is super smooth, very buttery. As said, that's because it has the advantage of the post-production. It knows everything and what's happening, and then it can, find the smoothest line. The Hero 7 is the current standard, I think. It is super smooth, even through very aggressive maneuvers. Like you saw, this split S came through really nicely. And then we're doing this second split S here, also super smooth, super nice. Let's roll that back a tiny bit and have you look at the Osmo. If you look at this straight line here, for example, you'll see, slight, control movements, left and right. I had to avoid trees, I'm sorry. But then if you look at Real Steady Go, the very top layer, there is not a single control movement. If you roll that back again to the Hero 7, you'll see, you do see them, the control movements, but they're very subtle. I'd say they're slightly bit less than on the Osmo, but not too much. Not too much less. They're sort of similar. where the Hero 7 and the Osmo really differentiate themselves is in aggressive moves. The Osmo, I think, when it can't quite predict what it needs to do, it tends to just go crazy. So for example, this first split S is fine, but then as soon as we do this second split S here, watch what happens. It goes over and then, whoa! It basically has this sort of weird side jab. You don't really see it very well here in this side-by-side view. So let me just quickly try and find the clip where this came from. All right, we have this whole segment here again with the Osmo. As you see, this is nice. It's okay. You see the control moves happening. Okay. It's still a bit jarry just because of this sharpening. I mean, here the shutter speed is 1/20th, so it's still something that normally is relatively smooth, but the sharpening just makes it so crazy. I don't know. All right, so this is okay. Nothing special. This came out nice. And then this second move right here. Whoa! It just goes very aggressively and just follows the drone. I mean, this is not the only example I have of it. This happened several times, and you see it as soon as you start like banking one side or banking the other a bit too aggressively. You will see it. Whereas the GoPro tries to keep you a bit smoother on those paths. Now, I do realize this is a bit hard to see like this, so I've actually included each one of these videos for this particular segment as a separate video. There's 3 links in the description if you have a look. There's one for the Hero 7, one for the Hero 6, and one for the Osmo. You can have a look at those and make up your own mind on what you think is better. I said my opinion on it is that the Osmo is about as good as the Hero 6 used to be. In terms of stabilization, the Hero 7 is a bit better. Okay, and now the last part that has actually been wrongly talked about, I feel, is the storage. If you've done all this stuff here, all these steps, and then you mess up the storage, well, you're going to have a super nice image up to here, and then once you try to store it, it's just going to come out all pixelated if your bitrate is not good enough. And I feel like people have wrongly spoken about the Osmo, because the Osmo states that it can do 100 megabits per second. And while that is true, that is 100 megabits per second in a H.264 codec. And I apologize for getting technical, but the codec is essentially the language that the camera uses to write onto the disk. And when you use the H.264 codec, it's something that's meant usually for online publication. That is what it was meant for. On the other hand, the GoPro uses a H.265 codec, which is actually a higher compression algorithm. So while the GoPro only will shoot probably around 78 megabits per second, it actually depends on what you're shooting and what formats. Usually it will be 76, 77 when you're in 4K, just regular 16:9. If you shoot 4:3, that tends to go up a bit. So in the end, this is what you're gonna get. GoPro shoots H.265 at 78 megabits per second, whereas the Osmo shoots H.264 at 100 megabits per second. What is now the better quality? People have wrongly accused GoPro of having a worse quality, whereas actually H.265 has usually like a 25% to like 35% better compression compared to H.264. So your quality is actually slightly, equivalent or better on the GoPro. And I mean, that shows in the images when you look at the video side by side. Honestly, the two cameras look very, very similar. Alright, finally the end of this video. So it is time for the little conclusion. Let me just grab my cheat sheet to tell you my thoughts on the camera. So I really liked, the exposure, the way it exposed it didn't blow out the highlights. I like the UI, the camera controls are nice and precise and not as annoying as on the GoPro. Dewarp is really nice at 4K, that's a nice feature. I didn't talk about the front screen, but it does have a front LCD screen, which is pretty fun when you're taking selfies, but if you're shooting something and you're filming, you're using it professionally, it's not of much use. What I found was a bit of a moot point was the bitrate. People seem to hype that up. 100 megabytes per second at a H.264 is actually the same thing as the GoPro. We've had that for ages. And the GoPro sometimes even seems to do it even better. What I really don't like about the camera is the sharpening. It is just way too over sharpened. That is just crazy. There's no way to control it. I'm assuming that GoPro one day fix it. Assuming that they fix it, you still have the problem with the stabilization. The stabilization is about as good as the Hero 6 was, I think, and but it is way too zoomed in for that. So it is even worse than the Hero 6. Yeah, and it jitters also when you have your shutter speed is a bit too low, or if you have a bit too much vibration on your quad, you're going to get jitters, you're going to get vibrations, the footage is not going to come out good. So I don't know. Yeah, maybe I was a bit harsh on the stabilization. I think it works great for maybe some of the walking shots that I saw that I did also myself. Those work really nicely. Just on the drone, the prediction isn't quite there. As said, this is also a brand new camera, so you know, give DJI another month or two, they're probably going to come out with something better. It's just firmware upgrades at this point. But yeah, I mean, I think it's an interesting camera. Am I going to use it? I don't know. I may use it if people ask me to shoot linear mode, or if they ask me, you know, stuff that doesn't require any stabilization. I may use it if people like it. But I think it's, you know, a matter of brand. Do you prefer the GoPro brand or the DJI brand? I would say technically the GoPro is still better. The Hero 7 stabilization is still superior. And if you're looking for all-out incredible stabilization, well, you want to use a real steady. The stabilization on this is cute, but, you know, nothing new. So yeah, there you have it. Sorry this was a bit of a long video, but I hope to see you next time.